Thanks for attending our webinar on planning a commercial greenhouse. My name is Lindsay Schiller. I am one of the co-founders and currently the marketing director here at Ceres. Brian Van Way, our project manager, originally did this webinar a few weeks ago, but we decided to redo it to make it a little bit more streamlined. He was taking some questions during the presentation. So this is a shorter version of that original webinar we did. And we put this together with kind of two major goals to help educate people who are thinking about starting their first commercial greenhouse. The first is how to navigate the permitting process for a structure. And the second is some thoughts about creating a timeline for the construction process. We wanted to address these because we get these questions a lot when people come to us and are very unclear about how long the planning process is going to take, how long the construction process is going to take, how far out are they from actually growing. So it's going to be a pretty succinct and short webinar focused on those two things. Some things we're not going to discuss is construction details, costs, or budgets. Those are just far too customized to address in a broad webinar. And we're not really going to go into much design information about our greenhouse design, but you can find a ton of photos and information about that on the website. We have other webinars on passive solar greenhouse design principles if you want to look more into that. And then we're also available to talk to you individually if you want to get together for a conversation about your particular project. I did put in a couple of slides just to give some context about where we're coming from. So Ceres is a company based in Colorado. We're about 7 years old, and we are really the only commercial company that's specializing in passive solar greenhouse design. And what that phrase means is that these are greenhouses that are designed to harness the sun's energy, to use the sun's energy much more for passive heating and cooling throughout the year. And so they're designed to be vastly more energy efficient than a standard greenhouse. And I guess some broader context about that is the typical greenhouse design. See, I don't have a picture of, usually I have a slide in there about that, but the typical greenhouse design is a fully glazed structure. What that means is they're made of all plastic or all glass. And that design really originated in Northern Europe and was sort of designed for a low light climate that's also much milder than we have here in the States. So they were designed without much thought about energy costs, sort of with a cheap energy mindset. And the problem is that glazing materials like thin plastics or glass are extremely energy inefficient. So they leak heat very, very quickly. And you probably have a first-hand experience with this if you've ever sat by a window on a cold night. You can literally feel how inefficient that material is. And so when you build an entire building out of inefficient materials, you get extremely high heating and cooling costs if you want to grow year-round. With a typical greenhouse, it's usually either very difficult or very, very expensive to grow year-round in most North American climates that have freezing winters. So we approach this industry thinking that, okay, passive solar design has been around for decades in many other industries in terms of homes and commercial structures. Why not apply this to greenhouses to make them much more efficient? And so there's actually had already been several studies on passive solar design for greenhouses showing that they can perform better, they have similar light levels, and are vastly more energy efficient. So we got into this industry originally with residential structures, sort of backyard greenhouses, and then have slowly sort of expanded into the commercial sector, going a little bit bigger and bigger, starting with some schools and then now getting into commercial greenhouses. And we have a number of different industries that we particularly focus on as commercial greenhouse designers. Hydroponics and aquaponics have been two of our sort of niches that we found ourselves in, because particularly for aquaponics growers, they often need a more regulated environment to. They're not only trying to maintain air temperatures, but they're trying to maintain their water temperatures of their fish tanks. And an energy efficient greenhouse is a great match for that growing environment. And then most recently for the licensed cannabis growers, again, we found a very good match there, since that plant has very strict temperature requirements and often needs a warmer environment. So we often call ourselves as much of a research firm as a design and construction firm. A huge amount of our time goes into monitoring how our greenhouses perform. So every time we build a greenhouse, if the grower is okay with it, we monitor the temperatures in that greenhouse and see how it's doing, and then make any modifications that we need to in the next design iterations. So we're constantly evaluating our designs, taking in data, and then using that to improve. But we also design greenhouses in terms of either custom designs, or we make several standard building designs for residential growers. We do some commercial building throughout the US and Canada. And then we also do a lot of education like this webinar, and we have some in-person courses that we do in Denver, as well as speaking at trade shows and things like that. So how we work with customers is typically, you can work with them in several different ways. One is helping them plan a greenhouse, whether that's just putting in a couple hours at key decision points to help them along the way, making sure that they avoid pitfalls. So working with customers on an hourly basis. We do a lot of energy analysis for people to help them predict their operational budgets, and also putting in the right climate control systems. We design structures for people. Like I said, we do either custom designs and engineering, and we can put together a full construction document set that then you can take to a contractor and have them build it out for you. In addition, like I mentioned before, we do turnkey construction for certain size greenhouses, usually commercial structures. And then finally, we evaluate the greenhouses that we do build. So either evaluating their climate and helping someone optimize the growing environment by making key observations. For example, someone might be struggling with humidity, and we might notice that their fans aren't running often enough or not at the right times. We can help them adjust that and either reduce energy costs or optimize the growing environment. I wanted to make a few, just a clarification about who this presentation is mostly for. So kind of clarifying our assumptions about you, the audience. We are predicting that this is mostly going to benefit small-scale commercial growers. So growers who are probably less than an acre size facility, but definitely growing commercially, and usually as their first greenhouse. For the very large growers, over an acre size, we're guessing that they probably have either know this information or have someone who's professionally consulting them, or a construction manager who's taking all this on. So this presentation is really for people who are just getting into their first commercial greenhouse and are pretty much the ones who are doing all the legwork themselves, doing all the research themselves for the construction process. So our first topic, like I said, is the permit process. It is hard to make general descriptions or recommendations because this varies pretty widely based on your local county and building department. So everything depends on your building department, obviously. They're the ones who have the regulations, and permitting requirements can vary pretty much from county to county. But usually you're dealing with your county building department. In some areas, if you're in a city, you will have to deal with both the county and the city. Um, and our first recommendation is to get together with the building department for a pre-application meeting. In a few areas, this may even be required. Usually it's something that you can just do voluntarily, and it can be informal or formal. Sometimes it might just be walking into the building department some afternoon, waiting in line, and then waiting to talk to someone to find out more about what you need for the permitting process. And the purpose of this meeting is really just to get yourself set up for submitting the permit, to this is sort of your investigative phase of figuring out, okay, what do they want? What questions are they going to have? Anything else that I can provide to include with the actual permit so that all goes smoothly. So it's helpful to come with a little bit of information about what you're trying to do. If you have a site map of your location, of where you're building the greenhouse, any site elevation documents, if you have any existing sketches of the structure, that would be very helpful to bring. If you can bring any information about the materials that you'll be using, utility locations, basically anything that you already have on hand before you even start the permitting process or start getting your construction documents ready. Bring all that into them to start a conversation. And it can also be very helpful just to create a bit of a camaraderie or to get to know the building department so that they're a little bit more on your side, and you kind of generate a friendly relationship there. So after you go through that, they'll give you, at the pre-application meeting, they'll probably give you a list of everything that you need to create or have for an actual building permit. And among those things are the third bullet point down here. The main chunk of it is stamped building plans and a foundation plan. And what stamp means is that a structural engineer in your state has to engineer it and actually stamp that so that you can submit it and they know that it's been engineered for your local wind and snow loads. It may also require electrical and plumbing plans. They may have requirements about site elevation drawings, and they may have additional questions about what materials you're using. It's important to keep in mind not all building departments are familiar with greenhouse-specific materials, so oftentimes they have questions about, okay, what's the fire rating of polycarbonate, for example, because it's not as common as, say, drywall or wood. So you may need to have supplemental information about that. Yeah, so typically the structural plans are sort of the meat of the permitting process, and they'll specify a little bit more about what those plans have to include. Usually there's a big checklist that you have to make sure that you have everything that's required. So the pre-application process of sort of getting organized and getting your design ready is usually about a month to get your plans ready. Once you actually submit everything, we found that building departments usually take 1 to 2 months for approval. And we've had some projects that go far longer than that. Usually they have additional regulations, like especially if you have a cannabis greenhouse, then you're looking at probably a much longer permitting process because there's so much added regulation. But that varies pretty widely by your local building department. But we think 4 to 8 weeks is a pretty good time frame for what to expect. And after you submit to when you actually receive the building permit and can begin construction. So just because you have, a month or two on your hands, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily wasted time. You can really use that to go through a lot of other processes to get ready for the construction actual phase, which will sort of you'll see how that this kind of filters into your timeline process in a couple slides, that this could actually be a useful time. So moving into sort of our second phase of creating timelines, this can be as broad or as detailed as you'd like. Obviously, the more detailed is usually the better, and usually makes the construction process go smoother. And I want to just make the point that, particularly for the construction process, someone should be creating a timeline of the steps involved and when things need to be there. And that may be you, or it may be the general contractor if you're hiring out the whole building process, or it may be a third party, such as a construction manager. Oftentimes at Series, we sort of help a general contractor and a client create a timeline, since we know, when all the materials will arrive on site, so we can put that together and make sure that everybody's on the same page. But yeah, will obviously vary by project, and you want to be getting estimates from any of your vendors for the greenhouse materials, or your contractor, about how long each part of the process will take, so that you can start to fill out a timeline that's customized for your project. But this is generally, a topic that we get so many questions about, is, how long does it take to design and build? Like, when can I have the greenhouse? And it's obviously a very hard question to answer because it is so customized, but we wanted to put at least some numbers, some ranges on the table to give people an idea. And so we chose a 5,000 square foot greenhouse, so again, like a small scale commercial greenhouse, and gave estimates for kind of each of the major steps that go into building it. So first, I kind of talked about a little bit, is the design phase of when you are that sort of pre-application process of figuring out what kind of greenhouse you want and what you can have. And this varies hugely depending on the client. Some people know exactly what design they want. They know their interior layout, where the electrical is going to go, everything. And that can be you can easily go into the next phase of getting that plan engineered. Other people, there's a lot of time of back and forth between, they may just have a rough idea or a total square foot size that they want, and then we give them an initial design. They have some feedback, we come back and redesign, and that goes on for it can take several months to get just the concept finalized. But once you do have the general design finalized, we then take that, or you can take that to an architect to get formal construction plans drawn up. So an architect will draw one set of construction plans. What happens then is you give the construction plans to an engineer, or a company. Like at Series, we sort of do this entire process in-house, where the architect will have plans drawn up, and then the structural engineer will redline them, which means just engineering them. The plans are redrawn, and then the engineer stamps them so that they're ensured to be designed for the right wind and snow loads. So all of that time of getting the construction documents ready and any other documentation that you need to submit the building permit, again, that's a few weeks just between that back and forth between architect and engineer and you. So you want to add on a few weeks there. like I mentioned before, about 1 to 2 months after you submit the permit to receive the permit. So planning in for that time. After you receive the permit and you're all set to go, we then broke down the construction process a little roughly here. So first step would be just to get your site ready and the foundation. And this, again, obvious variation depending on what kind of state your site is in. If it's a level site that's ready to go, a lot shorter than if you need to do any leveling or grading and all those things. The next obvious step is building the greenhouse, and our typical time frames for a commercial greenhouse is a couple months. So I would say probably about 2 months for the majority of the build. With our kit greenhouses, it's usually a bit shorter, maybe about a month. And when I say our kit greenhouses, we have one line of greenhouses that is our high yield kits, and they're prefabricated metal sections. In other cases, we're doing a sort of custom commercial steel structure. And so all of that obviously affects your build time. So after those couple of months, which are usually occur hopefully during a summer season or spring or fall, something where you're not dealing with as much harsh conditions, you go through sort of what we call finishing and details, any sort of siding, trim work, painting, adding on a few more weeks for that, and then finally installing your interior grow equipment. So if you add all these up, you're anywhere from a few months to well over a year between when you first start to just have this, your first thought of having a greenhouse to actually putting a seed in the soil. And you can sort of do your own estimates about best case, worst case scenario and where you think you'd fall for each of these. But we just, again, want to lay that out there as to give people sort of a little bit of a reality check of how long it takes to build a greenhouse. It's usually not something that happens within 3 or 4 months, just because of typically a building permit is involved, and then that adds on a whole other stage of wait time. I shouldn't say wait time, but of time to get ready. A tool we use and we recommend, again, for either you or a contractor or someone to put this out into a visual form in what's called a Gantt chart. And Gantt doesn't really stand for anything. It's just the name of whoever came up with this layout. But it's just a visual display of all of those ranges of time for each phase of the project. And this is really helpful because you can see sort of what things overlap, and then also you can start to get a feel for, okay, what things need to be completed before the next phase can occur. And that's really helpful to make sure that you're staying on track and things move along. You can do this for free. You can create one in Excel. They have some templates that will set up a Gantt chart pretty easily for you. Or we use this program called Smart Sheets, which is very useful and intuitive. This is just a close-up of that previous slide, so you could get a sense of what that looks like. Here, this is probably not something that yours would look like. This is what we're doing for our clients. If they add on certain options, then it would have another time period associated with it. But as you can see, after the vendor price lock happens, going down to about the mid-row, then we can deliver the contract, and we expect the contract would take only a day in this case. And after the contract occurs, then the client will review the contract, and that will take about a week. So that's an example of just how you get a sense of, okay, this needs to happen before the next stage can occur. And it's particularly helpful once you start getting into the construction phase of the project, which may have been a better example for this slide, but because once you get into the construction phase, you need to make sure that all your materials are delivered on time in order for the next phase of the construction process can begin. And so, as we say here, delivery timing is essential to know and have laid out in a Gantt chart or some sort of timeline, so that you make sure that there's not just huge delays on the job site and things move along pretty smoothly. And then my other point here was just that it's helpful to be pretty detailed about, as much as you can, about breaking down the construction process in a timeline. And if you don't feel comfortable or knowledgeable enough to do that, then we can certainly help you, or a contractor can certainly fill that in for you. But it does help the building process move a lot quicker. We have a slide here just on choosing contractors, because I think this is another sort of reality check for people. I don't think they often think about, if they order a greenhouse, they may need a local contractor to erect it. And so this will all depend on the type of greenhouse you choose. In many cases, the greenhouse company, like what we do, is we provide a prefabricated structure kit, and then that's delivered to the site, whether it be Florida or Alaska. And then we or the client organizes a local contractor to do all of the construction on site. With our commercial projects, we can organize that. And in some cases with our kit projects, in some cases we ask for the client to do some of that legwork in terms of soliciting and selecting a contractor. And so that completely depends on the greenhouse company you choose. Some of them are more turnkey and hands-on than others. In other cases, you may just get one shipment to the site and you have to figure out everything on your own. So in that process, things to think about is really just critically insurance. And that's just like any insurance and sort of reliability. And just like selecting any sort of contractor for your home, you want to be checking references and background and doing some due diligence there. And then also making sure that they have the right crew and equipment, and understand the size and the scale of the project. And so hopefully the greenhouse company, like we do at Ceres, can provide some support in terms of, here's some types of companies to look for, or here's how to navigate that process. So Brian put this in just as sort of some anecdotes I think he had here, and some final tips from what we found. It's true, I think, just it's like anything else. It's sort of plan for the worst and hope for the best. And not necessarily plan for the worst, expecting it to happen, but just have sort of the longer timeline be on your radar. These things do tend to take a bit longer than you think. You can get 2 out of 3 good, fast, and cheap. It's very hard to get everything perfect from a contractor or the company that you're working with. Inspect all your shipments when they arrive. This is immediately when they arrive. This is very, very useful to document any sort of damages right when they get there. If you let it sit out, in your driveway for 2 weeks, then open up the polycarbonate and find out it's scratched or something, that's very hard to go back and claim that the shipment was damaged. Likewise, keep all your receipts, anything that comes with the materials. And then his last point here was that any sort of involvement you can get from your community, whether that's some neighbors to help you build the project, local organizations, involving the building department when you can by asking them questions and getting their input, making it a bit more of a community process, we found is really helpful and helps projects succeed. And if you ever get kind of overwhelmed, or usually there's a point where things look like they're not going so well, we like to say just keep the end in mind and envision the greenhouse that you're creating, and it's a lifelong investment that you're working towards, so it's worthwhile. So if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you so we can provide more specific advice. Best way is to shoot us an email at info@seriesgs.com. And yeah, we hope we can address any more individual questions or concerns that you have on your project more with you.